The richest man in the building walked past the one person who carried his future every single morning, and no one dared tell him. Before sunrise painted the skyline silver, Ethan Carter was already inside Knight Global headquarters, pushing a quiet janitor's cart through marble hallways that reflected more wealth than he had ever imagined growing up. The building never truly slept. Security guards changed shifts, maintenance crews disappeared before executives arrived, and the cleaning staff quietly erased every trace of yesterday so tomorrow could look perfect. Ethan preferred it that way. Invisible people attracted fewer questions. His oversized gray maintenance jacket hid the gentle curve beginning to show beneath his uniform, and every morning he adjusted it carefully before stepping onto another polished floor. At 6 months pregnant, even simple tasks demanded more energy than anyone around him realized. He cleaned conference rooms where billion-dollar decisions had been made, emptied trash cans filled with expensive lunches barely touched, and wiped fingerprints from glass walls that overlooked the entire city. Most employees never learned his name. To them, he was simply the quiet janitor who always lowered his eyes and smiled politely. That suited Ethan just fine because secrets survived longer when nobody remembered your face. Every few hours, he slipped into a small supply closet on the 32nd floor, where an old folding chair sat beside shelves stacked with paper towels and disinfectant. Hidden behind a box of cleaning supplies was a small insulated lunch bag containing water, fruit, vitamins, and the prenatal supplements his neighborhood clinic had provided. He rested there for exactly 5 minutes, one hand gently over his stomach, whispering reassuring words only his unborn child could hear. Just a little longer, he murmured with a tired smile. We're doing okay. Unknown to Ethan, he was not the only one protecting that secret. Maria, the senior housekeeper who had worked in the tower for almost 20 years, quietly rearranged schedules whenever Ethan looked exhausted. Ben from building security conveniently ignored the extra breaks. Recorded on hallway cameras. Even the cafeteria cashier slipped extra milk and fresh fruit into Ethan's bag without charging him. None of them knew who the baby's father was. They only knew the young Omega worked harder than anyone else and never complained, even when his ankles swelled after walking miles across polished floors every shift. Rumors, however, had begun spreading upstairs. Someone in accounting claimed the janitor was hiding a pregnancy. Someone in human resources insisted it would become a liability if clients noticed. Another executive joked that appearances mattered more than personal problems. The whispers floated through elevators faster than official emails, growing colder every day. Ethan heard enough to understand what was coming. If management confirmed the rumors, his job would likely disappear before his child was born. Still, he showed up every morning because rent could not be paid with fear, and babies needed more than hope. What Ethan never realized was that another story had quietly begun unfolding beyond the walls he cleaned. Thousands of miles away, the company's elusive alpha CEO, Adrian Knight, had abruptly canceled an international business tour and boarded the earliest private flight home without explaining why. Senior executives assumed it involved a merger worth billions. His personal assistant noticed something stranger. Adrian had requested security records, employee files, and maintenance logs from headquarters before the plane even landed. He wasn't searching for a financial report. He was searching for someone. And inside the gleaming tower where everyone believed the quiet pregnant janitor had successfully become invisible, fate was already walking through the front doors. Ethan Carter measured his days by the sound of elevator chimes and the weight of the mop bucket he pushed across 40 floors of polished marble. Every shift followed the same careful rhythm because routine was the only thing keeping his world from falling apart. He always arrived before dawn, always finished the executive offices before 8 o'clock, and always avoided eye contact whenever groups of employees gathered near the coffee stations. Remaining unnoticed had become a survival skill. Unfortunately, invisibility was becoming impossible. His pregnancy was no longer something he could completely disguise beneath loose uniforms. Every week, the gentle curve beneath his jacket became more noticeable, and every curious glance lingered a little longer. Ethan caught whispered conversations stopping whenever he entered a hallway. He heard laughter fade into uncomfortable silence. Even without hearing every word, he understood exactly what people were wondering. He simply lowered his eyes and continued working. Bills still arrived every month, and fear had never paid a single one of them. During his afternoon break, Maria quietly joined him inside the supply closet carrying a small paper bag from the cafeteria. Inside was a warm bowl of vegetable soup, fresh bread, and a carton of milk. Ethan immediately shook his head. "Maria, I cannot keep accepting this." The older woman smiled gently as she folded her arms. "You are accepting kindness, not charity. There is a difference." Ethan looked down, his eyes shining with gratitude. "I will pay everyone back someday." Maria reached over and adjusted the collar of his oversized jacket. "The only thing you need to repay is that little life depending on you. Take care of yourself first." Ethan nodded quietly before placing one hand over his stomach as a soft flutter reminded him that he was never truly alone anymore. Across the building, another conversation carried a very different tone. Inside a conference room overlooking the city, the Human Resources Director reviewed staffing reports with several department managers. One supervisor casually mentioned that the maintenance division might soon require a replacement because one employee appeared unable to continue physical work. Another executive frowned as she glanced through a personnel file. The janitor named Ethan Carter has missed several opportunities for overtime recently. Productivity has declined. Nobody asked why. Nobody considered that climbing endless staircases while expecting a child might require extraordinary determination rather than criticism. The meeting ended with one simple instruction. Human Resources would privately evaluate Ethan's employment status before the next quarter began. Meanwhile, Adrian Knight's private jet landed just outside the city. Instead of heading directly to interviews or investor meetings, he remained seated inside the aircraft reviewing digital files that had been delivered during the flight. Hundreds of employee records appeared across his tablet, but he ignored executive profiles and financial summaries. His attention remained fixed on maintenance schedules, security logs, and visitor records stretching back several months. His assistant finally spoke after several minutes of silence. "Sir, the board expects you tomorrow morning." Adrian never looked up from the screen. "Reschedule them for the afternoon." "May I ask what takes priority?" Adrian paused before quietly answering. "Someone disappeared from my life before I had the chance to understand why. I have reason to believe the answer has been much closer than anyone realized." Back inside headquarters, Ethan finished cleaning the executive boardroom without noticing the framed company photograph hanging above the fireplace. It showed Adrian Knight smiling beside international business leaders during last year's charity gala. Ethan never looked at it long enough to recognize the familiar eyes that had once changed the course of his entire life. And only a few floors below, the elevator carrying Adrian toward the lobby had already begun its silent ascent. The following morning unfolded like every other until the quiet rhythm Ethan Carter depended on began slipping away one small moment at a time. A maintenance supervisor who normally nodded in passing suddenly stopped speaking when Ethan approached. Two assistants from Human Resources stood outside an elevator, lowering their voices as he walked by before pretending to study a clipboard. Even the cleaning schedule taped inside the janitor's closet had been marked with fresh handwritten notes assigning Ethan to areas where fewer clients would see him. He understood the message without anyone saying it aloud. They wanted him hidden. Ethan took a slow breath and reminded himself that every shift completed meant another paycheck, another week of groceries, another doctor's appointment for the tiny heartbeat growing stronger each day. He refused to let shame become heavier than hope. Around noon, he finished polishing the executive hallway when a sudden wave of dizziness forced him to steady himself against the wall. He closed his eyes for only a moment before Maria hurried toward him carrying a bottle of water. "Sit down," she whispered with gentle concern. Ethan smiled apologetically. "I'm all right. I just stood up too quickly." Maria folded her arms, clearly unconvinced. "You have been saying that for 3 weeks." Ethan accepted the water and rested on a nearby bench tucked behind a decorative planter where visitors rarely passed. His hand instinctively rested over his stomach as the baby shifted gently. The movement brought an exhausted smile to his face. "See," he whispered softly. "You are reminding me not to work too hard." Maria watched quietly before asking the question she had carefully avoided for months. "Does the baby's father know?" Ethan looked toward the enormous windows overlooking the city. After a long silence, he answered honestly. "No, I never told him." "Would he have wanted to know?" Maria asked. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. I believe he would have. But life became complicated before either of us had the chance. His voice carried no bitterness, only quiet regret. Several floors above, the Human Resources Director finalized paperwork recommending Ethan's employment be reviewed for medical limitations and public image concerns. The recommendation had not yet become an official decision, but copies were already circulating among senior managers. One supervisor questioned whether removing a hard-working employee was necessary. Another simply replied, "Executives expect perfection from this building. Perception matters." None of them realized that the executive whose opinion mattered most had already entered the headquarters through a private entrance beneath the tower. Adrian Knight moved through restricted corridors without an entourage, speaking only with the chief of security. Instead of requesting financial updates, he asked for archived visitor logs, temporary employee records, and maintenance assignments from nearly a year earlier. The security chief looked confused. "Sir, these are unusual requests." Adrian answered calmly. "Sometimes the smallest names disappear inside the largest companies." As the files continued arriving, one employee profile briefly appeared on the monitor before another document covered it. Ethan Carter, Maintenance Division, hired 11 months earlier through an emergency staffing agency. Adrian's eyes paused for only a second, not because he recognized the name, but because something about the hiring date stirred a memory he had never been able to explain. At that exact moment, completely unaware that fate had begun closing the distance between them, Ethan gathered his cleaning supplies and walked toward the executive conference floor carrying nothing except a mop, a bucket, and the quiet determination to protect the child who had already become the center of his entire world. By Thursday afternoon, the atmosphere inside Knight Global headquarters had changed in ways even visitors could sense. Conversations stopped when Ethan Carter entered a room. Managers who had never acknowledged his existence suddenly watched him with careful expressions, while several executives quietly exchanged emails marked confidential. Ethan did not need access to those messages to understand what they contained. Years of surviving difficult circumstances had taught him to recognize when people were preparing to make a decision about someone without inviting that person into the conversation. He simply kept working. Every polished window reflected a young Omega trying to appear stronger than he felt. Every freshly cleaned conference table reminded him that dignity was something a person carried within, not something an expensive office could provide. Late that afternoon, Maria found him replacing supplies in the executive lounge. She hesitated before speaking. "Human Resources asked about your medical condition today." Ethan slowly closed the cabinet door without looking surprised. "I wondered when they would." Maria stepped closer. "They asked whether you had requested accommodations." Ethan smiled gently. "I never asked for special treatment." "Sometimes accepting help is not weakness," Maria replied. Ethan looked toward the city skyline, glowing beyond the glass walls. "Maybe not. But I cannot risk giving them another reason to believe I cannot do this job." Before Maria could answer, Ethan's company radio crackled to life. The maintenance supervisor instructed him to report to the executive conference floor immediately because an important visitor inspection had been added to the schedule. Ethan gathered his supplies and quietly made his way upstairs, unaware that several directors had already assembled nearby for an emergency leadership meeting. At the same time, Adrian Knight stood inside a secure archive room reviewing employee records that had not been digitized. Most executives would have delegated the task, but Adrian insisted on reading every document himself. A faded visitor log from 11 months earlier caught his attention. One name appeared beside a charity fundraising gala hosted in the building before Ethan had officially joined the maintenance staff. Ethan Carter, temporary catering assistant. Adrian frowned. The name stirred a memory buried beneath months of international travel and relentless business negotiations. He could almost remember a quiet conversation on a rooftop terrace, someone whose calm presence had briefly allowed him to forget the endless expectations surrounding his position. The memory remained frustratingly incomplete, but it refused to disappear. "Find every employment record connected to Ethan Carter," Adrian instructed his assistant. "Do not notify anyone yet." His assistant looked puzzled. "Is there a problem, sir?" Adrian answered thoughtfully. "I do not know yet. That is exactly what concerns me." Down the hall, Ethan entered the executive conference level carrying a fresh bucket of water and clean microfiber cloths. Several senior managers glanced toward him before quickly looking away. One whispered that he should not be working in such a visible area. Another quietly replied that there was no time to move him because the chief executive officer had unexpectedly changed his schedule and was walking through the building personally. Ethan heard only one sentence clearly. The chief executive officer is already inside the tower. His heartbeat quickened for reasons he could not explain. A strange feeling settled over him, as though a chapter of his life he had tried to close was preparing to open again. Without realizing it, Ethan rested one protective hand over his stomach while the elevator at the far end of the corridor chimed softly, announcing the arrival of the one person neither destiny nor truth intended to keep away any longer. The elevator doors opened with a quiet chime, and the entire executive corridor seemed to pause. Department heads straightened their jackets, assistants gathered their tablets, and conversations disappeared into complete silence. Adrian Knight stepped forward with the calm confidence of someone who never needed to announce his arrival. His presence alone transformed the atmosphere. He greeted no one immediately, choosing instead to observe the people around him with thoughtful eyes that missed very little. Ethan Carter lowered his head and continued wiping the polished glass outside the boardroom, hoping to finish before anyone noticed him. He reminded himself that the chief executive officer had no reason to look twice at a janitor. Unfortunately, fate had different plans. As Ethan reached to clean the highest corner of the glass panel, the sudden movement caused a small bottle of prenatal vitamins to slip from the oversized pocket inside his jacket. It landed softly on the marble floor and rolled several feet before stopping near the polished shoes of the human resources director. The hallway became painfully quiet. The director looked down, then slowly picked up the bottle, reading the label without saying a word. Several managers exchanged uneasy glances. Ethan walked forward with trembling hands and quietly said, "Thank you. That belongs to me." Instead of returning it immediately, the director looked toward another executive and sighed. Perhaps this confirms we should have our discussion today. Ethan felt every pair of eyes settle on him. He understood exactly what discussion they meant. Before he could respond, Maria stepped forward from the housekeeping team. "He has completed every assignment we have given him. His work has never fallen below expectations." One manager replied politely, "This is not about performance. We must consider safety, insurance, and the company's professional image." Ethan gently accepted the bottle after it was handed back to him. His voice remained calm despite the growing tension. "I understand your concerns. If you believe I cannot continue working, I will accept your decision." Maria looked at him in disbelief. "Ethan, do not give up so easily." He offered her a grateful smile. Sometimes protecting peace costs more than protecting pride. Standing several yards away, Adrian had remained completely silent throughout the exchange. He had intended to continue toward the boardroom, but something kept drawing his attention back to the young Omega speaking with such quiet dignity. There was something strangely familiar about Ethan's voice. Something about the gentle kindness in his expression awakened fragments of memories Adrian had spent nearly a year trying to understand. He watched Ethan instinctively rest one protective hand across the curve beneath his oversized jacket. The simple gesture stirred another memory. A quiet evening. A rooftop overlooking city lights. A soft voice speaking about dreams instead of ambition. Adrian frowned slightly as the forgotten moments pressed harder against the edges of his mind. His assistant leaned closer and whispered, "Sir, the board members are waiting." Adrian answered without taking his eyes off Ethan, "They can wait another minute." At that exact moment, Ethan bent to lift his cleaning bucket. The effort made him lose his balance briefly before catching himself against the wall. Adrian took an unconscious step forward before stopping, surprised by his own reaction. He did not yet understand why every instinct urged him to make certain the quiet janitor was all right. Neither man recognized the other completely, yet an invisible bond seemed determined to bridge the distance that months of silence, misunderstanding, and circumstance had created. And somewhere deep inside Adrian's memory, the final missing pieces had already begun quietly falling into place. Adrian Knight watched the quiet janitor longer than anyone expected, and the silence stretching through the executive hallway became almost impossible to ignore. Senior managers exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to continue the meeting or wait for instructions. Ethan Carter lowered his eyes, embarrassed by the attention, and quietly reached for the handle of his cleaning cart. He wanted nothing more than to finish his shift and disappear before the situation became even more uncomfortable. "One moment," Adrian said calmly. His voice was not loud, yet every person in the corridor immediately stopped moving. Ethan froze and slowly turned around. Adrian stepped closer, studying him with thoughtful eyes. There was no accusation in his expression, only quiet curiosity mixed with something he could not explain. "How long have you worked here?" Adrian asked. Ethan answered respectfully. "Almost 11 months, sir." The number struck Adrian harder than he expected. 11 months. The same length of time since one unforgettable evening that had never truly left his mind. "Before this job," Adrian continued, "were you working at a charity fundraising gala hosted by this company?" Ethan's breathing caught for the briefest moment. He looked up instinctively, meeting Adrian's eyes for the first time. The world around him seemed to disappear. Those silver eyes, that calm voice, the gentle kindness hidden beneath a composed exterior. Memories he had carefully locked away suddenly returned with startling clarity. Adrian noticed the same realization spreading across Ethan's face. Fragments became complete pictures. A rooftop garden above the city. Quiet conversation beneath summer lights. Two lonely people sharing hopes instead of titles. A farewell that neither of them had expected to become permanent. Adrian spoke almost to himself. "It was you." Ethan's lips parted, but no words came. He had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways during lonely nights, yet none of those dreams had prepared him for reality. Before either of them could continue, the human resources director stepped forward with obvious discomfort. "Sir, I apologize for interrupting, but this employee's situation requires immediate administrative review." Adrian slowly turned toward the director. "Administrative review?" The director nodded carefully. "There are concerns regarding workplace suitability and company policy." Adrian glanced back toward Ethan, whose hand instinctively rested over the gentle curve beneath his jacket. For the first time, Adrian truly noticed what everyone else had already seen. Ethan was expecting a child. His heart began racing as countless unanswered questions collided at once. Why had Ethan disappeared? Why had no one informed him? How had they ended up standing only a few yards apart for months without either of them knowing? Adrian looked directly at Ethan. "Would you come with me?" Ethan hesitated. "Sir, your meeting." Adrian gently interrupted. "Nothing scheduled today is more important than understanding what happened." Shock rippled across the hallway. No executive had ever seen Adrian cancel responsibilities without hesitation. Ethan remained silent for several seconds before giving a small, uncertain nod. As they began walking toward a private conference room, neither noticed the stunned expressions surrounding them. The managers who had spent days discussing paperwork now watched the chief executive officer personally escort the quiet janitor through the executive floor with a level of respect no one could explain. Behind them, Maria quietly smiled through grateful tears. She did not know the full story, but for the first time since Ethan had arrived at the building, she believed he would no longer have to carry every burden alone. The private conference room overlooked the entire city, yet neither Ethan Carter nor Adrian Knight paid any attention to the breathtaking view beyond the windows. The silence between them carried nearly a year's worth of unanswered questions. Ethan remained standing near the door, still wearing his gray maintenance jacket, his hands folded together as though he expected to be asked to leave at any moment. Adrian slowly set aside the employee file he had been reading. "Please sit down," he said gently. Ethan hesitated before taking a seat across the table. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Adrian broke the silence. "I searched for you." Ethan looked up, surprised. Adrian continued quietly. "After the charity gala, I returned to the rooftop the following morning. Security reviewed every guest list and catering record we had. I even asked the event company for temporary employee information, but they told me several workers had been hired through outside agencies. Your name was never connected to that evening." Ethan's eyes widened. "I thought you had forgotten." Adrian slowly shook his head. "I remembered more than you realize. I remembered a kind person who spoke honestly when everyone else wanted something from me. I remembered someone who made one ordinary evening feel more genuine than an entire year of business meetings." Ethan lowered his gaze, emotion softening his voice. "I left because I believed our lives belonged in different worlds. You were the leader of this company. I was only someone passing through for one night. Adrian leaned forward. You decided that for both of us without giving me the chance to choose. Ethan closed his eyes briefly before answering. A week after the gala, I learned I was expecting a child. Before I could find the courage to contact you, the temporary agency closed. My phone number changed after I moved apartments, and every attempt to reach the company ended with another assistant telling me the chief executive officer was overseas. After a while, I convinced myself you were happier never knowing. Adrian's expression filled with quiet regret. I would never have considered our child a burden. The room fell silent again as Ethan instinctively rested one hand over his stomach. Adrian followed the movement with gentle eyes before asking softly, "How far along are you?" "Just over 6 months," Ethan replied. Adrian released a slow breath, realizing how many important moments had already passed without him. You have carried every appointment, every worry, every decision alone. Ethan offered a faint smile. Not completely alone. Some good people here showed me kindness when they did not have to. Adrian nodded thoughtfully, remembering Maria and the others who had quietly protected Ethan without expecting recognition. A light knock interrupted the conversation. Adrian's assistant entered carrying a folder with obvious hesitation. "Sir, Human Resources is waiting for your approval regarding Mr. Carter's employment review." Adrian accepted the folder, read only the first page, then calmly closed it. He looked directly at his assistant. "Cancel the review." The assistant blinked in surprise. Immediately, Adrian answered without the slightest hesitation. "Immediately. And arrange a meeting with every department director within the hour. There are several policies inside this company that will be changing today." Ethan stared at him in stunned silence, realizing that for the first time since discovering he was going to become a parent, the future no longer felt like something he had to face by himself. Within an hour, every department director gathered inside the main executive boardroom, uncertain why an emergency meeting had been called without advance notice. Rumors spread quickly through the building. Some believed a major acquisition had fallen apart. Others assumed investors had demanded immediate changes. No one expected the quiet janitor from the maintenance department to enter the room beside Adrian Knight. Ethan Carter paused near the doorway, clearly uncomfortable, standing among executives dressed in tailored suits, while he still wore his simple maintenance uniform. Adrian noticed the hesitation and spoke calmly enough for everyone to hear. "Please stay. This discussion concerns you as much as it concerns the company." The room fell silent. The Human Resources Director carefully opened a folder, preparing to explain the previous recommendation, but Adrian gently raised one hand. "Before anyone speaks," he said, "I have already reviewed every document connected to Mr. Carter's employment. I have also learned that several employees quietly supported him when they believed he needed help. Their compassion reflects the values this company should have demonstrated from the beginning." Maria and Ben, who had been invited unexpectedly, exchanged surprised glances from the back of the room. Adrian continued, "No employee should ever believe that asking for understanding will cost them their livelihood. Effective immediately, all employment reviews involving pregnancy, medical accommodations, or family responsibilities will require my personal approval until our policies are rewritten." Several executives lowered their eyes, recognizing the quiet criticism without Adrian raising his voice. Ethan remained speechless. He had entered the room expecting to witness decisions about his future. Instead, he was watching those decisions change because of him. Adrian then turned toward Ethan with a sincerity that surprised everyone present. "There is something else I need to say publicly." Ethan's heart began beating faster. Adrian met his eyes before continuing. "Months ago, circumstances separated two people who never intended to lose contact. Neither of us knew how completely our paths had been hidden from one another. That misunderstanding ends today." He paused only briefly before adding, "I intend to be present for every part of my child's life that still lies ahead, if Ethan is willing to allow me that opportunity." No one in the room moved. The revelation settled over the executives with quiet disbelief. Ethan looked down, taking a slow breath before answering honestly, "I never wanted to keep our child away from you. I only believed I had no way to find you anymore." Adrian nodded gently. "Then neither of us needs to carry regret by ourselves any longer." Tears quietly filled Maria's eyes as she watched Ethan smile for the first time since she had met him. It was not a smile of relief alone. It was the expression of someone who had finally stopped expecting to face every tomorrow alone. As the meeting concluded, Adrian asked his assistant to prepare a flexible work arrangement for Ethan, comprehensive medical coverage, and paid parental leave that would begin whenever Ethan chose. Then he quietly added one final instruction: extend the same family support program to every eligible employee in this company. Kindness should never depend on a person's job title. For the first time in years, the culture inside Knight Global did not begin changing because of a business strategy or financial report. It began changing because one quiet Omega had refused to give up despite believing no one important would ever notice his courage. 8 months later, the first light of autumn streamed through the tall windows of Knight Global headquarters, illuminating a building that somehow felt warmer than it once had. Employees no longer hurried past one another without a greeting. Family photographs decorated desks that had once displayed nothing except financial reports, and the company wellness center welcomed workers from every department without distinction. The greatest transformation, however, could not be measured in policies or quarterly reports. It could be seen every Friday morning when Adrian Knight walked through the lobby carrying an infant in one arm, while Ethan Carter laughed softly beside him. Their son, Noah Knight, had inherited Ethan's gentle smile and Adrian's bright silver eyes. He had become the unofficial mascot of the entire headquarters, smiling at receptionists, charming security officers, and somehow convincing even the busiest executives to pause for a few moments before rushing into meetings. Maria proudly claimed she had become Noah's honorary grandmother, while Ben insisted that security cameras had never protected anything more important than the little boy who giggled whenever he heard his familiar voice. Ethan no longer worked overnight cleaning empty hallways. Instead, after completing professional training sponsored by the company, he accepted a new position leading Knight Global's Employee Care and Family Support Office. The promotion had not been offered because of his relationship with Adrian. It reflected the quiet compassion, resilience, and integrity Ethan had demonstrated long before anyone discovered who he was. Employees sought his guidance because he listened before speaking and understood that every person carried unseen burdens. Adrian often watched from his office as Ethan greeted staff members by name, remembering birthdays, encouraging new parents, and making certain no employee ever felt invisible again. One afternoon, after finishing a company family celebration, Adrian and Ethan returned to the rooftop garden where they had first met nearly 2 years earlier. The city stretched endlessly beneath the evening sky, but neither of them was interested in the skyline. Noah rested peacefully in his stroller nearby while a cool breeze carried the first hints of autumn through the garden. Adrian reached for Ethan's hand with a quiet smile. "I used to believe success meant building the tallest company in the city," he admitted. "Now I know success begins when the people inside that company know they matter." Ethan looked toward the lobby far below where employees and their families were still leaving together after the celebration. "You changed more than a business," he said softly. Adrian gently shook his head. "We changed it together. You reminded me that leadership is not measured by how many people work for you. It is measured by how many people feel valued because of you." Ethan smiled before looking toward their sleeping son. "Then I think Noah has already given both of us the greatest promotion we will ever receive." As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the city skyline, the rooftop that had once witnessed 2 strangers saying goodbye became the place where a family quietly celebrated a future they had almost lost. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories do not begin with wealth, power, or perfect timing. Sometimes they begin with a kind heart that refuses to stop hoping, even when the world chooses not to notice. And sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the one who changes countless lives simply by reminding them that every human being deserves dignity, compassion, and the chance to be seen.